Do you believe in rebirth? Maybe most of us would say absolutely not, but some things are beyond our understanding, and maybe that's what we call God's plan, shaped by our karma. Marcus Webb trusted his wife with everything, his heart, his money, his life. But she betrayed him. She killed him for his property and called it an accident. She thought it was over. She thought she had won. She believed she would spend the rest of her life in luxury with her boyfriend. But some betrayals don't end with death, and some debts are never forgotten. Marcus didn't disappear. He came back. He reborn. But this time he returns as Elijah. Not to start over, but to finish what they started. And this is a story of reborn for revenge. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Atlanta, Chicago, Miami, Houston, or somewhere else. Take a second to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. The Atlanta skyline at golden hour looks like a promise kept. And for Marcus Webb, it was exactly that. A promise he had kept to himself since he was 17 years old, watching his father lose everything to a bad business partner and a worse economy. Marcus had sworn, standing at his father's funeral with $22 in his pocket, that he would build something no one could take from him. He built it, brick by brick. Webb Construction started as a two-man operation out of a rented garage in College Park. By the time Marcus was 34, it had 17 full-time employees, 3 active contracts with the city of Atlanta, and a reputation for finishing on time and on budget. He owned a 4-bedroom home in Buckhead, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always trimmed and the neighbors wave from Range Rovers. He drove a black Escalade. He wore his grandfather's gold watch every single day. Not to show off, but because it was the only thing his grandfather left behind, and it reminded him that time, once gone, never returns. His wife, Diane Webb, was the kind of woman a room noticed before she said a word. Tall, polished, with a smile that arrived slightly before her eyes caught up. They had met at a rooftop party in Midtown 6 years ago. She had laughed at something he said, and he had been foolish enough to believe that laugh was only for him. They married after 2 years. In photographs, they looked like everything. Behind the photographs, Diane had grown quietly restless. Not because Marcus mistreated her. He didn't. Not because he neglected her. He worked hard, but he came home. Her restlessness was a different kind. The kind that comes from wanting more than what is earned, from believing that patience is for people without options. And Diane believed she had options, specifically Roland Price. Over 6 careful months, Roland drafted fraudulent property transfer documents with surgical precision. Diane practiced Marcus's signature until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. Joint accounts were restructured. The Buckhead Homes deed was transferred into a shell LLC that Roland controlled. Marcus's business account had a secondary authorization added, unnoticed in the paperwork flood of a busy quarter. Roland was a property attorney with an office on Peachtree Street, a Georgetown law degree on his wall, and the kind of smooth confidence that courtrooms and vulnerable women both tend to reward. He and Diane had known each other since college. What had been dormant for years reignited quietly, then urgently. Roland didn't just offer her attention, he offered her a plan. Marcus noticed the numbers first. A missing deposit, a transfer he didn't recognize. He said nothing immediately, sat with it, checked again, pulled 3 months of statements. The picture that emerged was not an accounting error. It was a portrait of betrayal, drawn slowly and deliberately by 2 people he had trusted with different parts of his life. He came home one evening, placed the bank statements on the kitchen counter, and looked at his wife. Diane didn't flinch. She was already ready for what came next. The conversation that happened in that Buckhead kitchen was not loud. That was the part that haunted the walls afterward, the quietness of it. Marcus was not a man who screamed. He had grown up watching men lose their dignity by losing their composure, and he had made a private vow against it. So he stood at the kitchen counter, statements spread in front of him, and spoke in a low, measured voice that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Diane listened. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She stood on the other side of the kitchen island with her arms crossed and her face arranged into an expression of tired impatience, as though Marcus were the inconvenience in this situation. From the living room, barely visible through the half-open door, Roland Price sat on the couch Marcus had picked out in the house Marcus had paid for, straightening his cufflinks and listening to every word. Marcus told her plainly he would be contacting his attorney in the morning. He would file to have every fraudulent transfer reversed. He had documentation. He had evidence. He took photographs of every page of the statements with his phone before he walked out of his own front door into the Atlanta night. Roland made a phone call before Marcus's Escalade had cleared the neighborhood. What followed happened over the next 9 days with the kind of careful patience that only truly dangerous people possessed. There was no rush, no panic. Roland had handled complicated situations before. He knew that the worst decisions were made in urgency, and so he waited, watched, and planned with the cold efficiency of a man who had long since stopped feeling things that inconvenienced him. On a Tuesday night in November, Marcus was driving home from a late meeting with his attorney in Midtown. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, the heavy, relentless kind that turns Atlanta highways into dark mirrors. He merged onto I-285 heading west, his grandfather's watch catching the glow of oncoming headlights. The brakes responded normally for the first 3 miles. Then, on the elevated stretch above the Chattahoochee, they didn't respond at all. The Escalade hit the guardrail at 62 miles per hour. The barrier gave way on the left side, a section that had been quietly, partially compromised sometime in the previous 48 hours. The vehicle went through and fell. The water was black and fast-moving. Marcus Webb's body was recovered the following morning. His grandfather's watch was still on his wrist, stopped at 11:47 p.m. Roland Price handled the legal proceedings personally, citing his professional relationship with the family. The accident investigator assigned to the case had received a cash transfer 3 days prior, untraceable, routed through 2 accounts. A truck driver who had been parked on the shoulder that night and had seen a dark sedan pacing Marcus's Escalade for half a mile before the crash was visited by 2 men 2 days later. Within a week, he had relocated to Pensacola, Florida, with enough money to disappear quietly. The ruling came back in 11 days. Accidental death due to mechanical brake failure and adverse weather conditions. Roland filed the paperwork. The case was closed. By the following Friday, Diane had transferred the remaining assets. The Buckhead home stayed in her name. Webb Construction was dissolved, its contracts redistributed, its employees scattered. Marcus Webb, who had built something from nothing with his own hands, was erased from the record with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly how the system worked, because he was the system. That Sunday, Diane and Roland had dinner at Bones Restaurant on Piedmont Road. She ordered the lamb, he ordered the ribeye. They touched glasses over candlelight. 11 weeks later, in a hospital 3 states away, a baby drew its first breath and screamed like a man who had unfinished business with the world.
The Carter family did not announce the birth of their son the way ordinary families did. There was no social media post, no mass text message chain. Instead, Derek Carter, founder of Carter Energy Group, one of the most significant black-owned oil and real estate conglomerates in the American South, simply called his mother, his pastor, and his attorney. In that order. He was a man of priorities. Elijah James Carter arrived in the world at 3:09 a.m. on a cold February morning at Houston Methodist Hospital. His mother, Simone Carter, held him first. She said later that he didn't cry the way newborns usually do, frantic and disoriented. He cried once, deeply, and then went quiet. He opened his eyes almost immediately, which the nurses remarked upon, dark, steady eyes that seemed, in that strange first moment, to be looking for something. Elijah grew up inside a world of extraordinary privilege, but wore it the way old money does, quietly. The Carter estate in River Oaks was a 12,000-square-foot property with a guest house, a private tennis court, and a library that Derek actually used. Elijah had private tutors from age 5, traveled to 4 continents before age 12, and sat in on his father's board meetings from the time he was 14, not as a spectacle, but because Derek believed that wealth without understanding was just a liability waiting to happen. By every visible measure, Elijah Carter was one of the most fortunate young men in Texas. He was sharp, disciplined, and operated with a stillness that made adults in rooms of power instinctively take him seriously. His Harvard acceptance, when it came, surprised no one. His professors would later describe him as the kind of student who asked questions that were 3 steps ahead of the lecture. But there were things about Elijah that no one, not his parents, not his therapist, not his closest friends, could fully explain. He never wore a watch, not once in his entire life, despite being gifted 3 separate luxury timepieces on birthdays and graduations. Each one ended up in a drawer, untouched. When asked why, he would pause just a moment too long before saying he simply didn't like them. He could not cross a bridge in rain without a physical reaction, tightening chest, cold sweat along his spine, a disorientation that lasted several minutes. His parents attributed it to an anxiety disorder. His therapist had a clinical term for it. Elijah accepted the explanations because he had no better ones. And he dreamed repeatedly of a bridge, always the same bridge, always at night, always the same sensation of water rising and the inability to determine whether he was remembering something or warning himself. He kept a journal which he never shared with anyone. In it, over the years, were sketches he had drawn half-consciously during late nights, a house with a particular roofline, a woman's profile seen from across a room, hands signing a document, and the bridge, always the bridge, in rain. He didn't know what any of it meant. Not yet.
Elijah was 19, home from Harvard for the Thanksgiving holiday, when the first wall cracked open. The evening was unremarkable in the way that comfortable family gatherings tend to be. The Carter home full of relatives, the smell of food moving through every room, the low, pleasant noise of people who knew each other well. A family friend, Uncle Clarence, a man in his late 60s with a deep love for old soul music, connected his phone to the living room speaker system after dinner and began playing what he called the real classics. The third song that came through the speakers was Luther Vandross. Elijah was mid-conversation near the fireplace, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, half listening to a cousin talk about a new business venture, when the opening notes arrived in the room. Something happened to him that he would spend years trying to accurately describe and never quite manage. It was not a memory, not exactly. It was more like a door in a wall he hadn't known existed, swinging open 2 inches, just enough to let in a sliver of cold air from the other side. The room blurred at its edges. Sound became muffled, as though he had been pushed underwater. In the space behind his eyes, fragments arrived without invitation or explanation. A woman in a white dress, laughing in a room with high ceilings and warm light. Hands, his hands, but not his hands, reaching toward her. A feeling of complete and uncomplicated happiness, the kind that only exists before something destroys it. Then, just as suddenly,
it was gone. Elijah was standing by the fireplace with his sparkling water, and his cousin was still talking, and Luther Vandross was still playing, and no one in the room had noticed that for approximately 45 seconds, Elijah Carter had been somewhere else entirely. He excused himself, walked down the hallway to the downstairs bathroom, closed the door, and stood at the sink with both hands on the cold porcelain. He looked at his own face in the mirror for a long time. His reflection looked at him with the same expression it always had, composed, unreadable. But behind his eyes, something had shifted, the way the ground shifts slightly before an earthquake that hasn't arrived yet. He opened his journal that night and sketched for 2 hours without stopping. The woman in the white dress, the room with high ceilings, and for the first time, a new detail his hand seemed to know before his mind did, a gold watch on a wrist catching light. He stared at the sketch of the watch for a long time before closing the journal. He didn't sleep well for the next 3 weeks, but he told no one, because he had no language yet for what was happening, and Elijah Carter had never been a man who spoke before he understood. He filed it, waited, and without knowing he was doing it, he began to pay attention in a different way.
The fragments did not slow down after that Thanksgiving evening. They accelerated, gradually at first, then with an increasing frequency that began to occupy the edges of Elijah's daily life, like a sound heard from another room that grows louder the more one tries to ignore it. At Harvard, during a property law seminar, a professor displayed a standard deed transfer document on the projector screen. Elijah's jaw tightened involuntarily, a surge of something between anger and nausea moving through his chest so quickly that he pressed his pen hard enough into his notebook to tear the page. He excused himself after class, walked to the riverbank behind campus, and sat on a bench in the cold until the feeling dissolved. He could not explain what had triggered it. He wrote in his journal that night, "Something about that document felt personal, like seeing evidence of something done to me." The journal was filling up. By spring semester, Elijah had begun researching reincarnation, not spiritually, but methodically, the way he approached everything. He read academic papers, case studies documented by psychiatrists at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, accounts of children who carried detailed memories of previous lives that were later verified. He read without judgment and noted what matched his own experience with the dispassion of a man assembling a case file. His father had arranged a summer business internship in Atlanta. Carter Energy Group was exploring a commercial real estate partnership there, and Derek believed strongly in his son learning markets from the ground up. Elijah accepted without hesitation. He didn't examine why Atlanta felt significant to him. He simply booked his flight. The moment his rideshare crossed the I-285 bridge on the way from Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, his body responded before his mind could intercept it. His right hand found the door handle and gripped it completely without his instruction. His breathing shallowed. Cold moved across the back of his neck like a hand placed there. Through the window, he watched the guardrail pass, and in the space of 3 seconds, saw it break apart and fall away into darkness and black water below. He asked the driver to pull over on the far side of the bridge. He stood outside on the highway's shoulder for 20 minutes, cars passing in the wet heat of the Atlanta summer, staring back at the elevated stretch of I-285 over the Chattahoochee. His hands had stopped shaking by the time he returned to the car, but something inside him had made a decision, a quiet, cellular decision below the level of conscious thought. He was in the right city. He was supposed to be here. That night, in his hotel room in Midtown Atlanta, he opened his laptop and typed 2 words into the search bar: Marcus Webb. The results were modest: a brief death notice from 2017, a dissolved business registration for Webb Construction LLC, a single archived news item about a car accident on I-285.
The article was 11 paragraphs. It described the accident as a tragic mechanical failure in adverse weather. It mentioned the deceased was survived by his wife, Diane Webb, and had no children. Elijah read the article 4 times. Then he closed the laptop, lay on his back on the hotel bed in the dark, and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The bridge, the rain, the watch, the woman, the documents. It was assembling itself, piece by piece, whether he was ready or not. 3 weeks into his Atlanta internship, Elijah attended a charity gala at the Four Seasons Hotel on 14th Street, a fundraising event for Atlanta public school arts programs, the kind of evening that drew the city's professional class in cocktail attire and practiced smiles. His father's Atlanta contact, a developer named Bernard Holloway, had included Elijah in his table as a courtesy to the Carter name. Elijah moved through the event the way he moved through most social gatherings, present, observant, participating just enough. He had learned early that rooms told you more when you listened to them than when you performed in them. He stood near the bar with a glass of water, watching the room fill, when Bernard appeared at his elbow and guided him toward a group of guests near the east window. She was standing with her back partially turned, speaking to a woman in a red dress, holding a champagne flute in one hand and gesturing with the other, the gesture of someone telling a story they had told before and still found entertaining. She wore a deep emerald gown, diamonds at her ears, her hair swept up. She laughed at something, and the laugh carried the particular quality of a person who understood how their laugh landed in a room. When she turned, when Diane Price's face came into full view, Elijah's body did something it had never done before in any social setting in his entire 19 years of life. It stopped. Not dramatically, not visibly. From the outside, he simply went still, but inside, every fragment that had been arriving in pieces over the past year and a half, every sketch in the journal, every night sweat on the bridge, every inexplicable reaction to documents and watches and rain, collapsed inward and locked together like a vault door closing. He saw himself standing in a kitchen, statements on the counter, the same face, younger, watching him from across an island with arms crossed and eyes that had already moved on. He saw himself outside in the rain, looking up at a window, and she was there, watching him leave without expression. He saw headlights. He felt the steering go. He felt cold water rising over the door seams in the dark. He set his glass of water down on the nearest surface, carefully, without a sound. Bernard was speaking beside him. Elijah heard none of it. Across the room, a man appeared at Diane's side, a man in a charcoal suit with the polished proprietary ease of someone who had learned to occupy expensive spaces as though they had always belonged to him. Roland Price. His hand went to the small of Diane's back in the automatic way of a man marking something as his. He said something into her ear. She tilted her head and smiled. Elijah watched them for 90 seconds. His face the entire time was completely calm, the kind of calm that is the absence of feeling, but the total, disciplined containment. He excused himself from Bernard's company, walked to the hotel lobby, and sat in his car in the parking structure for 53 minutes. Then he opened his laptop, created a new encrypted folder, and typed a single name at the top of a blank document: Marcus Webb, Atlanta, 2017. Underneath it, he typed 2 more words: find everything.
Elijah Carter returned to Houston at the end of his internship with 12 pages of handwritten notes in a locked journal, an encrypted folder on a password-protected laptop, and an expression that his mother described, privately, to his father as the same face he had when he was 3 days old, like he already knew something. He told no one what he had seen at the gala. He told no one about the bridge or the fragments or Marcus Webb. Elijah had grown up watching his father operate, and the most important lesson Derek Carter had ever taught him, not in words but in consistent example, was that power exercised loudly was power half spent. The man who announced his moves lost them. The man who moved in silence arrived. He spent 2 weeks doing nothing, attending classes, eating dinner with his dormitory floor, running his usual 6 miles every morning along the Charles River. He needed the distance to be sure, to confirm in the cold, undramatic light of ordinary days that what he believed was real and not the elaborate architecture of a young man's overworked mind. It held. Every morning it held. In October, Elijah used a shell company he incorporated under a Delaware business registration, a structure he had learned from his father's attorneys and filed himself, cleanly and legally, to retain Meridian Consulting Group, a private intelligence and forensic research firm based in Washington, D.C., that worked exclusively for corporate clients and charged accordingly. He paid their retainer from a personal investment account his father had set up for him at 16. He gave them Marcus Webb's name, the date of the accident, Roland Price's law firm, and 3 specific instructions: find the financial trail, find the case file, and find any witnesses. He did not explain why. Meridian did not ask. Over the following 8 months, the file they built was delivered to Elijah in sections, each one arriving encrypted, each one reviewed by Elijah alone late at night at a desk in his dormitory room with the door locked and his phone face down. The forged deed transfers emerged first, Roland's digital fingerprints embedded in the document metadata, traced through 3 iterations of revision that predated Marcus's death by 5 months. The offshore account came next, a Cayman-routed fund that had received 4 transfers from a joint account Marcus didn't know had a secondary authorization added. The accident investigators' financial records revealed a $15,000 cash deposit made 72 hours before he filed his report. The truck driver was the final piece, Darnell Hughes, currently residing in Pensacola, Florida, operating a small landscaping business. Meridian located him in 6 weeks. He had never spoken to anyone after relocating. He was not a dishonest man. He was a frightened one, which was a different thing entirely. He had a daughter in middle school. He had a mortgage. He had received a visit from 2 men who had explained, without raising their voices, what would happen to the things he cared about if he filed a statement about what he saw on the I-285 bridge on a Tuesday night in November. Darnell Hughes had made a survival decision. Elijah understood it without judgment. The Meridian final report was 214 pages. Elijah read all of it in one night. When he finished, he closed the file, sat in the dark for a while, and then reached under his bed and pulled out the cardboard box he had kept for 2 years without fully understanding why. Inside it was a gold men's watch, purchased from an estate resale website 18 months prior. The listing had described it simply as a vintage timepiece from an estate sale circa 2017. He had recognized it from the sketch in his journal the moment he saw the photograph online. He had bought it within minutes of finding the listing. He held it in his hand now in the dark and felt the weight of it, the specific, familiar weight of something that had once belonged to him in a way that could not be documented or proven or explained to anyone in a room. But he knew, and knowing was enough to begin.
The approach required patience above everything else. Patience of the particular kind that belongs to people who understand that the best traps are the ones the target builds themselves. Elijah returned to Atlanta 6 months later, this time not as an intern, but as a principal. Carter Energy Group was expanding its commercial real estate footprint in the metro Atlanta market. This was true, and Derek Carter had been happy to let his son lead the exploratory phase. It gave Elijah legitimate standing, a legitimate reason to be in the city, and legitimate access to exactly the world he needed to enter. Roland Price's firm, Price & Associates Property Law, was well regarded in Atlanta real estate circles. High-value clients, clean public record, polished office on Peachtree. Elijah had a mutual contact make a warm introduction, framing the Carter family's interest in Atlanta commercial properties as a significant incoming opportunity. Roland responded within 24 hours. Of course he did. The Carter name was the kind of name that made attorneys rearrange their calendars. The first meeting took place in Roland's conference room on a Thursday morning. Elijah arrived 2 minutes early, not 5, not 10, 2, which communicated confidence without eagerness. He sat across from Roland Price and spent 90 minutes discussing Atlanta's commercial real estate market, zoning regulations, and acquisition strategy. Roland was impressive in the room, knowledgeable, articulate, reading people quickly and adjusting his register accordingly. He was exactly as sharp as Elijah had expected. Elijah gave him nothing. He asked thoughtful questions, he took minimal notes, he was pleasant and gave no indication of anything except a wealthy young man exploring a new market. At the end of the meeting, he told Roland he would be in touch and thanked him for his time. Roland walked him to the elevator personally. The second and third meetings followed over the next month. Roland began inviting Elijah to client dinners, the kind of evening where business was the framework, but relationships were the actual currency. It was at the third such dinner that Diane appeared. She was exactly as he had seen her at the gala, composed, socially fluent, moving through a room with the ease of a woman who had learned to treat every space as a stage she was performing on for her own benefit. She was introduced to Elijah as Roland's wife. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her eyes moved over him the way they moved over every attractive, wealthy young man who entered her atmosphere, with a calibrated, barely visible interest that she would never acknowledge directly. She asked him questions about Houston. She laughed at his answers with slightly more warmth than the conversation warranted. Roland watched this from across the table with the particular attention of a man who had won and knew it, the slightly elevated pride of a person whose partner draws the interest of others. He knew no threat. Elijah was 20 years old, barely. He had no idea. Elijah ate his dinner, made polished conversation, asked Diane one question about Atlanta's philanthropic community that made her feel interesting, and left the dinner having given both of them exactly what he intended, the impression of a young man who was impressed by them. He sat in his car afterward and looked at the restaurant entrance for a moment. Then he took out his encrypted phone and sent a single message to the federal prosecutor's office, a man who owed Derek Carter a significant professional debt and the integrity to want to repay it the right way. The message read, "I'm ready to talk about the file." Everything that followed was architecture. Designed, load-bearing, assembled with the understanding that what was built to last required every piece to be placed in the correct order. Elijah spent 4 months in careful coordination. He was not in a hurry. Hurry was for people who were afraid of losing. Elijah was not afraid of losing. He had already lost everything once, and he had come back from it, and that knowledge sat inside him like ballast. His federal contact, Assistant U.S. Attorney Gregory Niles, a meticulous, quietly ambitious man who had spent 6 years building financial crimes cases, reviewed the Meridian file and spent 2 weeks confirming its integrity. What he found was not circumstantial. The forged document metadata was prosecutable. The offshore account trail was prosecutable. The bribed accident investigator, now identified, located, and quietly approached, was willing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge. He had been living with the weight of what he had done for 7 years, and the relief in his voice when Gregory's team contacted him was, by all accounts, immediate. Darnell Hughes was the variable that required the most care. Elijah did not approach him directly. He had Gregory's office arrange witness protection consultation first, formalizing the safety guarantee before a single conversation about testimony occurred.
When Darnell finally sat across from Gregory Niles in a federal building in Tallahassee, he had his attorney beside him and a protection agreement in front of him. He talked for 4 hours. His account of the dark sedan pacing Marcus Webb's Escalade on the I-285 bridge, including a partial plate number he had memorized and never told anyone, broke the case open at its foundation. The partial plate was traced. The vehicle had been registered to a shell company. The shell company dissolved 3 weeks after Marcus's death. Its registered agent, a paralegal at Price & Associates. Elijah also engaged Vanessa Cole, an investigative journalist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who had spent 3 years covering financial crimes in Atlanta's legal community. He provided her with a curated set of documents, enough to build a story independently verifiable through public records, without her needing to know the source. Vanessa Cole spent 6 weeks confirming everything herself. She was thorough, ethical, and had been waiting for a story like this for most of her career. The date selected for publication and federal action was a Tuesday in November, 7 years to the day after Marcus Webb's Escalade went through the I-285 guardrail. It moved the way precision moves, not loudly, but completely. At 6 a.m., federal agents executed a financial records warrant at Price & Associates. At 7 a.m., Roland Price's personal and business accounts were frozen pending investigation. At 8 a.m., Vanessa's story went live on the Atlanta Journal-Constitution website, fully documented, fully sourced. The headline reading, 7 years, 1 question. Was the death of Marcus Webb an accident? By 9 o'clock, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. Roland learned about the warrants while getting dressed for work. He arrived at his office to find federal agents already inside. His assistant was crying at her desk. His name partner was on the phone with a crisis attorney in New York. Diane was contacted by the Fulton County District Attorney's Office before noon. By 3 p.m., Roland Price was in federal custody on charges including fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to homicide. By 6 p.m., Diane had arrived at the police station with her attorney, a man who, like Roland, was not under indictment and therefore actually capable of helping her. Elijah watched the evening news coverage from his suite at the Lowe's Atlanta Hotel on Peachtree Street. He had ordered room service, a simple dinner, nothing celebratory. He sat in a chair by the window with the city spread out below him and watched the anchor describe the arrest of a prominent Atlanta attorney in connection with the death of a businessman 7 years prior. He poured 1 glass of bourbon. He drank it slowly. He felt no triumph. He felt something quieter and more complete than triumph, the specific stillness of a thing finally, fully resolved.
Roland Price spent his first night in federal holding in a state of controlled disbelief. The particular disbelief of a man whose entire identity had been built on the conviction that he was smarter than consequences. He had run through every possibility in his mind, every angle, every potential failure point in the plan he had constructed 7 years ago. He could not locate where it had unraveled. He could not identify who had pulled the thread. Elisha requested a brief meeting the following morning, presented as a concerned client seeking clarification about the status of the Carter family's pending Atlanta real estate matters. The request was granted. In the federal holding facility's consultation room, Roland was escorted in wearing civilian clothes, unshaven, the composure of the conference room entirely absent, replaced by the expression of a man who had not slept and was beginning to understand the dimensions of what surrounded him. Elijah sat across from him. He placed a single item on the table between them and removed his hand from it. A gold watch, scratched face, stopped hands, 11:47 p.m. Roland looked at it. His eyes moved from the watch to Elijah's face. Something shifted in his expression, a movement below the surface, the deep water movement of a man who recognizes something he cannot explain, recognizing him back. Elijah held his gaze. He said nothing. He simply waited with the patience of a man who had already waited 7 years in 2 different lifetimes for this moment. Roland opened his mouth. No language came. Elijah stood, straightened his jacket, and picked the watch up from the table. He fastened it onto his wrist, slowly, deliberately, for the first time in this life. It settled against his skin the way it always had, as though it had never left. He walked to the door. Before he reached it, he paused with his back still turned, not for drama, but because there was one thing left to leave in the room, and he wanted it to be the last thing Roland Price carried with him into whatever came next. He said you'd know what it meant. He walked out. The final morning of Elijah Carter's time at Atlanta, he rose before dawn and drove himself to the I-278 bridge, alone, no driver, the way some things need to be done. He parked on the shoulder and walked to the spot where the guardrail had been repaired 7 years ago. The new section was slightly different in color from the old, a seam in the metal, a scar the highway carried quietly, without explanation. The sky was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. The Chattahoochee moved below, dark and steady and indifferent, the way rivers are. The air smelled of morning and concrete and the distant memory of rain. Elijah stood at the railing and looked down at the water for a long time. He was not afraid. That was the thing he noticed most, the complete, clean absence of the fear that had lived in his chest before he had words for it. The bridge was just a bridge. The water was just water. The night that had happened here had been answered, and the account after 7 years across 2 lives was finally settled. Elijah unclasped the watch from his wrist, held it in his palm, felt its weight one last time, the weight of everything it had meant. Everything it had carried, everything it had weighted across years and lives, and an impossible distance to return to its rightful moment. He didn't throw it, he simply opened his hand and let it go. It turned once in the early light before it hit the surface. Then the river took it, the way rivers take everything eventually, quietly, completely, without ceremony. Elijah stood at the railing for another minute. Then he walked back to his car, started the engine, and pointed it toward the highway. He had a flight to catch, a life, his real life, his present life, his forward life, was waiting for him. He didn't look back. If you woke up one morning and remembered exactly how you died, remembered the face, the betrayal, the moment, and you had the power, the patience, and the resources to make it right, would you call it revenge or would you call it justice? If you enjoyed this story, like the video and drop a comment with your thoughts. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Thanks for watching.